The airplane hummed softly as it cruised above the clouds, a gentle rhythm that lulled many passengers into sleep. The cabin lights were dimmed, the smell of reheated meals fading, and the world outside the windows was nothing but a sea of darkness punctuated by faint, shimmering stars. Most travelers had retreated into their own bubbles, some reading, some whispering to companions, and others simply surrendering to the quiet comfort of slumber. Near the Riddle Rose, pressed against the cold window, a woman rested her head and closed her eyes. She was calm, unnoticed, her breathing even. To the casual observer, she was just another weary traveler, catching up on rest during a long journey. No one knew her name, no one guessed her story. She blended so seamlessly into the anonymity of travel that she might as well have been invisible. Hours slipped by in peace, until the captain's voice suddenly broke through the stillness. The intercom crackled, and the usual composed tone of authority had been replaced by something far more chilling. His words were sharp, urgent, almost trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is any fighter pilot on board, please make yourself known immediately." A silence swept across the cabin. Passengers straightened in their seats, their hearts thudding in collective unease. Fighter pilot? The phrase echoed in everyone's mind. Why would a captain, high above the earth, cry out for a fighter pilot among ordinary travelers? Whispers spread quickly, mothers held their children closer, and men glanced at one another with confusion and fear. Some passengers shook their heads, muttering nervously. Others simply froze, unable to process the weight of those words. The woman by the window stirred. Her eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the dim light. For a moment she simply sat there, listening, as if debating whether the call was truly meant for her. Around her the panic was rising, and the uncertainty in the air was heavy. Then, as if making a decision that had been long delayed, she stood. She stretched, smoothing her clothing with a calm precision, and began walking toward the front of the plane. Every set of eyes followed her. Murmurs rose in her wake, disbelief etched onto faces. Could it be her, that quiet woman who had slept through most of the flight? The flight attendants, visibly shaken, moved aside as she approached. Their eyes widened when she spoke in a voice low but steady. "Take me to the captain." When she reached the cockpit, the captain stepped out, sweat beading his forehead, his hands trembling slightly despite years of experience. His face was pale, his eyes full of strain. "One of my systems has failed," he said quickly. "The co-pilot collapsed. Medical staff is already trying to assist him, but without help, without someone who knows combat training and emergency maneuvers, we may not make it." His words were rushed, but the fear behind them was clear. The passengers behind him gasped. Some covered their mouths, others whispered frantic prayers. The woman did not waver. Her gaze locked on the captain's, her voice calm, steady, and surprisingly commanding. "I wasn't just a fighter pilot. I was the best in my squadron." For a long moment no one breathed. The captain blinked at her, torn between relief and disbelief. Then, with no other choice, he nodded and stepped aside. She entered the cockpit, her movements precise and deliberate, as though every step pulled her back into a role she once knew all too well. She slid into the co-pilot's chair, hands hovering over the unfamiliar commercial controls. They were different from the sleek and responsive machines she once flew, but her eyes held no hesitation. She whispered almost to herself, "Controls are controls, principles are the same." Alarms shrieked in the background, the flashing of red lights reflecting against her steady expression. The storm outside the plane rumbled, turbulence shaking the aircraft like a leaf in the wind. She grasped the controls firmly, her breathing even. The captain glanced at her, trying to measure her confidence. "Can you do this?" he asked. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. "Watch me," she said. Behind the closed cockpit doors, the passengers sat in a suspended state of dread. They could hear the metallic groans of the aircraft fighting the storm, the muffled alarms, the sound of the engines straining. Every second stretched long, every flicker of turbulence jolted hearts into throats. Some prayed silently, others sat rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. The uncertainty was unbearable. Inside the cockpit, the woman's mind was sharp, laser-focused. Memories of training returned to her in fragments. Nights on the runway, instructors barking commands, the dizzying pull of G-forces as she soared through skies far more dangerous than this. She had once mastered the art of flying when her very life depended on it. She drew from that strength now, every instinct awakening. The plane shuddered violently, and the captain reached for a switch, but she stopped him. "No," she said firmly, "let me handle it." Her fingers danced across the controls, adjusting with minute precision, fighting the storm's wrath with calm defiance. The turbulence eased slightly. The alarms dimmed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the captain allowed himself to breathe. He glanced at her profile, illuminated by the flickering glow of the instruments. She was steady, unshaken, carrying the weight of every life on board with the quiet strength of someone who had been here before, in the skies, with danger clawing at her from every angle, and survival depending on nothing but her skill and courage. And as the plane steadied under her command, the passengers still had no idea that the woman they had barely noticed hours ago, the one who had seemed so ordinary, so invisible, was now the only reason their story wasn't already over. The hum of the engines echoed like a heartbeat through the fuselage, every vibration magnified in the silence of the cabin. Passengers clung to their armrests, exchanging anxious glances, unable to shake the captain's desperate words from their minds. Any fighter pilot on board. The phrase lingered like smoke. They wondered what was happening behind the locked cockpit door, what kind of invisible war was being fought for their lives. The turbulence had subsided, but tension still gripped the air like a vice. Inside the cockpit, the woman's eyes scanned the instruments with razor-sharp focus. Though years had passed since she last sat in a fighter jet, the rhythm of flight lived in her bones. Her hands moved with instinct, adjusting throttle, correcting pitch, stabilizing the aircraft against unpredictable gusts. The storm outside slashed at the plane with sheets of rain and jagged forks of lightning, but she was steady, as though she had been waiting for this very moment her entire life. The captain sat beside her, glancing between her and the control panels, half in awe, half in disbelief. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, almost reverently. She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon displayed across the glowing screen. "Danielle," she said. "Danielle Rivers." The name seemed to carry weight, though he didn't yet understand why. He hesitated, then pressed further. "Where did you serve?" Her lips curved slightly, but her eyes remained hard. "In places you wouldn't want to imagine. I flew missions where a single mistake meant never seeing another sunrise. I've been shot at, locked on, chased through skies with nothing but instinct to save me. Compared to that, this storm is child's play." Her words were steady, but in the back of her mind, memories stirred. She hadn't meant to think about them. Not now. But the cockpit, the controls, the high-pitched alarms screaming around her all pulled her back into the years she had buried. She saw flashes of her past. The metallic belly of the jet she once called home, the roaring engines beneath her, the comrades who trusted her to protect them. And she saw the one mission that changed everything. The day she decided to walk away from it all. Been over a desert, years ago when she and her squadron were ambushed mid-air. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the sky lit up with tracer fire like a deadly fireworks display. One by one, she watched her fellow pilots fall, their jets becoming streaks of flame before vanishing into the earth below. She fought back fiercely, her every maneuver a dance with death, until only she remained. She landed that night alive, but her spirit felt shattered. She couldn't bear the weight of being the only one left. That was the day Danielle Rivers left the skies behind. At least, that's what she thought. A loud beeping snapped her back to the present. The fuel gauge blinked, warning of imbalance between the tanks. She quickly adjusted valves, steadying the flow. The captain looked at her, startled. "How did you catch that so quickly?" She gave a faint shrug. "You don't survive the missions I flew by being slow." In the cabin, fear continued to brew. A young mother whispered into her child's hair, telling him stories to distract him from the jarring bumps of turbulence. An elderly man clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Somewhere, near the back, a group of businessmen argued quietly about what could be happening, their voices tinged with panic. Each passenger carried the same gnawing thought. Were they minutes away from disaster? One of the flight attendants, pale and trembling, leaned close to the cockpit door. "Captain, please tell me there's hope," she whispered. The captain looked at Danielle, waiting for her to answer. Danielle finally turned from the controls, meeting the attendant's terrified eyes. "There's more than hope," she said firmly. "There's a plan." Her voice carried such certainty that the attendant actually exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the announcement. She walked back to the passengers with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. A ripple spread through the cabin. Hope, fragile but real. The storm thickened outside, lightning slicing dangerously close to the wings. Danielle tightened her grip, her jaw set. "She needs altitude," she muttered. The captain frowned. "That'll burn more fuel." "Better fuel than fire," she snapped. Her hands pulled back on the controls, guiding the massive aircraft upward, threading it through pockets of calmer air between the storm's fury. The plane shuddered, but obeyed, climbing steadily toward thinner clouds. Every second tested her resolve. Sweat trickled down her temple, but her breathing stayed measured. She thought of the passengers, the hundreds of lives depending on her. She thought of the child clutching his mother, the elderly man whispering prayers, the countless strangers who had no idea she once swore she'd never fly again. And she thought of her fallen comrades, the voices of the past whispering through memory. This time, she would not fail. The captain leaned closer. "You really were the best, weren't you?" Danielle didn't answer. Her eyes remained on the sky ahead, where a faint glimmer of light hinted at the storm's end. Her silence said enough. Behind them, the passengers still held their collective breath, but something subtle had shifted. They didn't know who the woman was or why she had answered the captain's plea, but they could feel her presence even from afar. She was fighting for them, unseen but undeniable, and for the first time since the terror began, they dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would see the ground again. But as the plane pierced through another violent gust and Danielle steadied it with flawless precision, a new alarm suddenly blared across the cockpit. The captain's eyes widened as he scanned the panel. His face turned ashen. "The storm has damaged the navigation system," he whispered. Danielle's hands tightened on the controls, her jaw hardening. "Then we'll do this the old way," she said, her voice low, her resolve unshaken. For the passengers, the nightmare was far from over. The cockpit was a storm of alarms and flashing lights, each warning signal screaming of danger the passengers could not see. The navigation system had gone dark, its screens blank, its guidance lost in the violent chaos of the storm. The captain swore under his breath, gripping the armrest of his seat, his face drawn tight with fear. For him, this was uncharted territory. He was trained for systems, for procedure, for instruments that guided his every move. But for Danielle Rivers, stripped of technology, it was something familiar. It was instinct. It was memory. It was the raw skill of a fighter pilot who had flown through skies that wanted to kill her. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the dark clouds beyond the cockpit window, searching for the subtle cues only a pilot like her could read. The texture of the storm, the shifts in the air pressure, the faint glow of lightning revealing layers of turbulence, all of it spoke to her in a language she thought she had left behind forever. Her hands adjusted the controls, steadying the plane like a rider calming a spooked horse. "We don't need their system," she said calmly. "I'll fly us out." The captain looked at her with disbelief. "Without instruments? That's impossible!" Her voice was firm, her gaze unwavering. "You've never fought your way out of an ambush with 3 enemy jets on your tail, half your gauges shattered, and your fuel running dry. I have. Trust me, Captain. Trust me, and we'll live." Her certainty left him no choice. He sat back, shaken, and let her take command. In the cabin, the fear was reaching a breaking point. The turbulence sent drinks spilling, bags tumbling from overhead compartments. A child began to sob uncontrollably, his mother clutching him tightly, whispering prayers into his ear. The elderly man, who had been silent for most of the flight, now muttered softly, his lips moving in desperate prayer. The businessmen who had once scoffed now clung to their seats, their faces pale, all their arrogance gone. A wave of quiet despair spread through the passengers, each person silently preparing for what they feared was the end. And then, suddenly, the plane steadied. The rocking smoothed, the violent jolts softened. A hush fell across the cabin, so profound that every breath could be heard. They didn't know why. They could not see her. But Danielle was fighting for them, coaxing the aircraft through invisible corridors of calmer air, guiding it away from the heart of the storm with nothing but her intuition and her will. Inside the cockpit, her mind was a battlefield. She remembered her fallen comrades, their voices echoing in her head. She heard her old commander shouting orders, heard the crackle of the radio, the desperate calls for backup that never came. She remembered the night she swore she would never fly again, the guilt that had weighed on her like chains. But now, as her hands moved across the controls with absolute precision, she understood why fate had put her on this flight. This was her redemption, not in combat, not in glory, but in saving strangers who would never know her full story. The storm began to thin. Through the thick veil of clouds, a faint glow appeared. Dawn. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the darkness, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Her lips pressed together in grim relief. They weren't free yet, but the light meant direction. It meant hope. The captain let out a trembling breath. "You've done it! We're breaking through!" "Not yet," she murmured. "Stay sharp." As the plane broke through the final layers of the storm, the damage became clear. The radio flickered in and out, navigation still dead, and fuel gauges were dipping lower than they should have been. They were alive, yes, but still lost in the endless sky. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned silently in her head. The rising sun told her east. The faint glimmer of land breaking through the horizon gave her a reference. And in her heart, the instincts of a fighter pilot, once buried, now awakened, guided her more surely than any machine ever could. She adjusted our course, steady hands on the yoke. The captain watched in silence, humbled beyond words. He had thought himself the leader of this flight, but beside this woman, he felt like a child in the presence of a giant. Minutes stretched like hours, and then, finally, there it was. A strip of land, a glimmer of a coastline, and the faint outline of an airport runway shimmering in the distance. Danielle's chest tightened, her heart pounding harder now than in any battle she had flown, not because of fear, but because of what it meant: survival, redemption. The captain's voice cracked as he spoke into the intercom, his composure returning at last. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain calm." The cabin erupted in quiet sobs of relief. Strangers clutched each other's hands. Prayers turned into gratitude, and hope bloomed where only despair had lived minutes ago. But Danielle knew the hardest part was still ahead: landing. The damaged systems meant she had no computer to guide the descent, no instruments to measure her glide path, no precision tools to align with the runway. This would be pure skill, pure instinct, and hundreds of lives depended on her being perfect. Her breath slowed, her eyes locked on the runway as it grew larger in the window. Every nerve in her body sharpened into focus. Her hands gripped the controls, her feet worked the rudders, and she felt the aircraft as though it were an extension of her very soul. The descent was rough, the wind still fought them, the alarms still blared, but she was unshaken. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set, and she whispered to herself, "Steady, steady." The wheels screeched against the tarmac, sparks flying as the massive plane touched down harder than anyone would have liked, but it held. The engines roared, brakes screamed, and at last the aircraft slowed, dragging itself to a trembling stop on the runway. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a wave of applause, cheers, and sobs filled the cabin. Passengers cried openly, clapping their hands, calling out thanks to a woman whose name most didn't even know. The captain turned to her, his eyes wet, his voice choked. "You saved us! I don't know how to thank you!" Danielle leaned back in her seat, her body trembling now that the fight was over, the adrenaline leaving her hollow. She gave a faint smile, weary but proud. "Don't thank me," she said softly. "Just remember that sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who will save your life." She stood, walked quietly back into the cabin, and returned to her seat. Passengers stared at her in awe, some whispering, some reaching out as though to touch her arm. But she closed her eyes once more, leaning against the window, just as she had before. To them she was a miracle. To her, she was simply a fighter pilot who had finally made peace with the sky. And when the plane rolled safely to the gate and passengers disembarked into the morning light, many of them would tell the story for years to come about the quiet woman who slept through the flight until the captain's terrified call revealed who she really was.